So we're here today to talk about how to write personal statements. Thank you so much for the panelists to be with us today. We have Carlotta Rosenbach, Leah Spence, George Bao, Mr. Steve Woodard, Nikki Stein. And each panelist will say what they do at the university, and they're going to give you their perspective on how to write an effective personal statement. So we're going to start with Mr. George Bao.
Okay, I guess I'll start off by talking a little bit about the process of writing personal statements, which can be very brief, or it can be a long, extended process. The first requirement, though, is to attend to the instructions that require the personal statement. Those are written very carefully. They're usually very brief, and they're very indicative of what each department is looking for. As part of tuning into what each department or professional school requires, I think it's very, very important to go talk to people. Every department, every professional school has people, advisors, or people on the admissions committee who will talk to you about what they are looking for in their personal statement, and usually they're very frank about what they're looking for. Often they invite people, they'll tell you that they'll look at your personal statement in advance before you even hand it in. And these are often the same people who will assess your personal statement after it's written.
On that set of people, it's important to think of them and to go to them because they're the audience that you're writing to. And by visiting them, by looking at what their concerns are, you're going to be more in tune to what they want to hear about you, rather than just what you want to say about yourself.
Yeah. The second stage after that, I think, has to do with writing down or identifying certain things you know you want to say in that personal statement. Arrange these in chunks, not necessarily trying to put them together, and then write those chunks. I usually advise students to write them separately and to write whatever comes into their head first, telling themselves, I'm not really writing my personal statement, I have nothing to lose, I'm going to let myself write what I really truly want to say. Whatever those happen to be. Get those chunks written as soon as possible. And then, while that is happening, at some point, you want to be thinking in the back of your mind, how are these going to fit together? How are they going to be thematized so that they form a coherent whole, or what's a persuasive logical sequence for them to be arranged in? But only after the chunks are written do you really have to start thinking about how they fit together. Fitting them together, to me, involves topic sentences, transition sentences, themes, coherence. Once that gets done, depending on your demands on yourself or perfectionism, you want to adopt a very patient attitude and read your personal statement many times and see how it makes you feel. Sometimes you'll read it and you'll have a little feeling of discomfort, or you just feel bored, or it's okay, but it's not exactly what I want to. It's nothing special. Pay attention to those feelings and put your statement away for a while, come back and read it again, or have someone read it with somebody. This is often the stage at which you see somebody from the instructional center or anybody else who's going to help you. And try to identify what it is that makes you feel uncomfortable, or what it is you're not perfectly happy with. And over time, my experience is things occur to you, solutions occur to you, why that one little phrase bugs you, occurs to you. It takes time, and it takes real patience, and it takes the ability to suspend the need to get finished, and just trust that it'll come to you in the course of thinking about it. And a lot of it is emotional and subconscious, not so much analyzing on the surface. One thing I do know is that when you get it when it's good, and I always feel like, I know a good personal statement when I see it. I might not be able to tell a person why this isn't a masterpiece at the moment I'm reading it. does become a masterpiece, I know it, and it's a really good feeling. So I guess my advice about the process is talk to people that know what is going to get you what you want, and then be patient about getting it into its final form.
If I can jump in here, I think it's real important that what you're saying, that the writing of the personal statement is, and how it's set up, that it flows well, that you're saying those things, that you're really trying to get over to your audience. That's important. But I think what students have to understand is that the personal statement starts long before you start writing that statement. The moment you decide on what pathway you're going to take, whether you're going into, my field is in health sciences. I deal with students in health sciences and those who are going into research. You have to start preparing to write that statement. And that means that you have to get the experience that is necessary for that field. The best thing to do is to get to a counselor as early as possible. Find out what is necessary. Talk to students who are in graduate programs, professional programs, and find out what is it that's necessary for you to write a good statement. Because writing a good statement is great. However, if you don't have the background necessary or the experiences, it's not going to help.
So you're sort of talking about building up the resume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good point, because students will come up and they'll have the list of things that the department wants to hear about, and one of them is work experience in the field, and they go, I don't have that. And if they had read those requirements when they were a freshman, then yeah, that's a good thing to think about. Because we as the writing people just think about the writing of the statement, but you're thinking about it as representing much bigger than just a piece of writing, and I think that's a good perspective.
And I would actually insert my thoughts in between where George is and where Carlotta is talking, and would actually encourage you, before you think about what is a personal statement, address the question of what a personal statement is not. And most importantly, it's not a space for professionalism, if you will. It's not a time for you to sit there and talk about all the things that you wish you would have done or that you could have done. What it is, on the other hand, is an opportunity for, and I'm just going to keep it in broad terms, an opportunity for you to show how this university, whichever one it's going to be, is going to help you achieve your professional goals, and equally important, what you're going to bring to that university so that they should want you to come to this university, if that makes sense. So before you go running down the street into the writing aspect of it, make sure you're clear on that aspect of it as well. And that's more of a just general philosophy, but I think it's going to make it easier for all those pieces that you're talking about to fall into place. You'll have a better idea of, well, what does this university value? Notice the word value. It's not that it's not good or bad. It carries weight with it. They're looking for certain pieces of that. Well, until you have a broad and general and specific understanding of that particular application, you're doing more than shooting yourself in your foot from our perspective. So just wanted to put that piece out there.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up the whole issue of content. What kind of things should you include and what should you not include? And some things, there are some specific things that I always look for when I read a student's personal statement. I look for them to give information about their background. And there are things you do and don't want to include, but if they are the first generation in their family to go to college, that's a really crucial piece of information. The personal statement nowadays is the only place where you can reveal cultural and ethnic aspects of your background too. So there's that kind of background piece. Then there's like the work experience piece, work experience that you have that relates somehow to your field, volunteerism, things like that. Then there's the section where you can address any kind of conspicuous absences or downfalls in your transcript that you have extenuating circumstances to account for why you got a 2.1 in a such and such class that might be, important to them. So the personal statement is a place where you can change those raw numbers of the transcript into a more human story. And talking about hardships is sometimes a really important part of the personal statement too.
All the hardships and all the cultural and ethnic background, while it may be very important, I think competence in the field is really the most important. Especially in the sciences, I think it's very important that people show their competence. And one way to do that is to talk about the research that they've done and to even use research questions, the kinds of questions that have come to them as they were doing research, because that shows both the competence and it shows the passion for the field, is to ask a research question, show how science, that you understand how science works, you know, or social science or whatever it is. And I also think it's much more important, unless you're applying to social work, to be competent rather than compassionate. You want to be compassionate, but Mother Teresa is not your role model unless you're applying to social work or something like that. So, well, you know, they ask those questions, don't overdo it, because it's not believable, and it's probably, most people would rather have a competent doctor than a doctor who's too chatty.
Well, I think part of this is that, again, students have been writing personal statements forever. What's happened over the decade that I've been at the university plus is that they start sounding alike. That I'm going to go back and serve my community, I'm going to do this, I have this hardship, this is what happened. And I think that a lot of schools are now past that. And they are looking for, you know, what are the experiences that you've had? You know, what have you learned from those experiences are real important. I think that it's important that a person be compassionate, that they do all these things, but hopefully that is what everybody going into that field has those same characteristics. So you have to come out with something that's unique. What is it that you have done? What are those things? What are the goals that you have, what are the long-term goals? But please don't start those statements when I, you know, from what I see in health sciences, when I was 5, I fell, I broke my leg, and the doctor was so wonderful. That made me want. Nobody.
All I want to do is save the world.
Yeah.
People, I just want to go work with the disadvantaged people. You don't
Which
know
may
what
be
it sounds
true.
like a missionary.
Exactly, which may be true, but you have to be able to narrow that down so that the person reading it is thinking about you while they move to the next one.
Yeah, they want it to be believable. And like Carlotta said, too many of them start sounding the same way, and it becomes a cliche, whether it's the diversity cliches or the, you know, these others. And one of our sayings at the Writing Center is show, don't tell. And what that means is, you know, think of the message you want to get across, whether, you know, responsible or whatever it is. And then think of something in your past, an event or an experience that you've had that illustrates that. But if you just start saying, you know, I'm brilliant, I'm responsible, I'm hardworking, no one's going to believe you. If you can illustrate it and make them think that about you, then you have conveyed the message.
The one thing the students have to understand is they have 2 pages in which to present themselves, and sometimes 1 page, you know, single space. And so they have to really think about what it is, and they have to look at the question. The one thing that I find, and the one concern that I have, not only with the personal statement, but with secondaries that students have, is that they answer whatever question they're thinking about. It is not the question that's on the page, and they have to be very, very sure what is being asked, and to fit into that statement, then those types of broad questions.
And sort of pick things in their past, whether it's a volunteer experience or whatever, that really illustrates what it is they want to get across. And one way to do that is, when they talk about research, is with questions. I mean, I always think that's a good way, maybe not.
Oh, I want to relate Nikki's advice to show, not tell, to something Steve said, which I think is really valuable and shouldn't be lost. Personal statements, this relates to what they should not be and what they should be. They're like, to me, advertising. Here's the institution I want to be into, here's me. They go together, and there's 2 categories through which they can go together. I want to do this, and these are the reasons why, or these are the experiences I have which convey where I want to. And I'm the type of person that this institution wants. But with regard to what Steve said about realizing what shouldn't be in there, it's almost as if you're walking a tightrope. And you need to strike a balance, a whole series of balances. One is what Nikki said, show, don't tell. So one balance is you want a good proportion of concrete claims and or abstract claims and concrete demonstrations of those claims. But you also want a balance between focusing on yourself and focusing on others. If you're talking about your past experience, you want a balance between what you learned and what you contributed to the organization. You want a balance between your past and your future. And if you just keep all those balances in mind, it can keep you from making the kind of errors that disqualify a fair number of personal statements from the greatest consideration.
And with that in mind, I would say I cannot stress enough the importance of the prep book. I guess is how I would look at it. It's just kind of what we're talking about here. And so I wanted to make it clear for myself as well, but also offer it up for feedback, which is you, as a writer, you have to be unapologetic for what you're writing. That is absolutely essential. While at the same time, you need to be humble in what you're saying. And that's a real challenge for most people. Young students who are the first in their family to go to college, but more grad school, is definitely going to be a challenge for you. Those of us who come from more of a communal background, it does go across the cultural lines, but it can also be anyone. This whole notion of singling yourself out and celebrating yourself while at the same time being humble, that's a real challenge to do. The way that we try to make sure that students understand, and I encourage those who are listening here, is to think of it this way. It's not so much that every line has to be so purposeful, but every line should reinforce and extend who you are. So if you read, it's great to start off with write what you have, but then go back and look at it. If there are pieces in there that are not advancing your cause, and your cause is to get into that school for that moment, just keep in mind, it's just for that moment. The personal statement is not the contract you're signing when you get your degree or whatever it's going to be. It is your claim to what you want to do and why you're applying to that place. But at the same time, it's got to be purposeful. It's got to be advancing that cause along the way. There was another piece in there that was more of the converse, which was, just as I'm saying, you have to be unapologetic, but at the same time humble. I'm going to have to come back to the thought.
But I want to elaborate on something you said. Sometimes students fall into, if they're talking about a particular field, they'll just go off and talk about that field for a while. And they're not talking about themselves anymore. And they always have to remember, this statement is about me. It's not about my field. It's not about the people I've worked with. It always has to be about them. And that's like what you were saying of your purpose. Every line has to be related to that purpose. And so they've been told all over and over, don't use I, but it's a personal statement, and they do have to always keep talking about themselves, which is going to be difficult because they don't like advertising themselves, and it does feel like an advertisement.
But
And
I
so
think
that humble versus, advertising is a hard balance.
I think it is important to talk about the field because that's where they show, like to graduate professional school, that's where they show that they can talk like an insider. So that's where they show their competence.
Well, what I'm saying is this, that they're talking about themselves in the field, not the field out there by itself, Yes, it's important to show that you fit into the field, but you want to be doing that while you're talking about yourself and your experiences within that
I
field.
really don't want to write a term paper.
Yeah, and sometimes they will. They'll talk about pharmacy and what pharmacists do, and it's like, well, these people reading this don't need to hear that. They want to hear about you and your fittedness for the field and for the program.
And when they talk about, like why this university, ways to connect are to talk about the faculty, the kinds of research that you're interested in that are done at that school, the kinds of, there's a particular program or something in the curriculum that is offered. Yeah?
Go ahead, I was going to say, I remember the other piece.
Oh, remember your other piece, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, along those lines, while you're talking about yourself, or that insider voice, that was the other piece for me, which is, in addition to celebrating self and being humble at the same time, you also need to be able to give an honest and critical critique of your skill sets. Not necessarily to the point that you're saying, oh wow, lousy, woo-woo, but I mean, you do need to have some pieces in there that acknowledge, I don't know it all. And that's a real hard piece to factor in as well, but at the same time, keep in mind the context. You don't want to say, oh, by the way, I'm a kleptomaniac. That wouldn't be something. But I have issues with something along the lines of whatever it might be, where you've got that, yes, I'm all that, but I also recognize I've got to work on these, and then the extension of that is, and this is why this program at this university is going to get me where I need to be.
Exactly.
So I'm extending the knowledge base I have, but also working on some skill sets that I might not be as comfortable with. And that's a hard balance again, I accept that, but...
Well, what you articulate there is representing your deficit as something positive.
Yes,
My deficit makes me even more fitted for your program. So.
But you're all teams.
I have a question, just to let people think about it, that sometimes we get, when they have to talk about leadership, a lot of our students have their leadership background with the church. And a lot of our students really are quite religious, so to what extent do you think they should discuss religion? Because it can, sometimes there are people that causes a negative reaction among the readers. Talk about knowing the audience.
Yeah.
And then, so it's, you don't, so what do you think of that?
Yeah, me personally, or
Or
just,
anybody.
I was going to say, my initial reaction goes back to, as you were saying,
Yeah.
this notion of audience. I think it depends on the program. I always look at it this way: it's better to put yourself out there than to come under this veiled illusion of this is what I'm going to be, because ultimately it's going to be you at that
Yeah.
university.
No, I always
That's
say,
such a big piece of
Be
it.
honest and tell the truth, but there's no need to tell the whole truth.
Yes, I mean, well, again, I think it's a whole other purposeful.
Yeah, because like what you were saying, does the sentence advance my cause?
Yeah.
My cause is to get into this program, so does my religious affiliation advance my cause?
Isn't it not just the affiliation, but they talk quite a bit about it.
Or my passion for my religion.
Yeah, see,
Does that advance my
I
cause?
often just tell people to think about it and to warn them that sometimes people have a bad reaction, at the universities to too much religion. Whether that's a prejudice or whatever, it still happens. So I tell them to think about it, and if your faith is so strong that you don't want to worry about it, that's fine too. But it's for them to decide it, because it is sometimes, I don't know, people have
Well,
bad
that's
reaction.
going to be a personal preference. I mean, whether a person writes about their religion or whatever, that's something the student has to make a decision.
Yeah, I tell them that
Does
too.
it fit into,
Yeah.
what they're asking for? And, when I think about a personal statement, the first personal statement that a lot of our students are writing are to the professional schools. And it's not to a specific school, it is to just like for students writing their AMCAS.
Yeah.
It's a very general statement that you're writing to all the schools, the 12, 15, 18 schools that you're making application to. Is when you come to the secondary, when you want to start looking at, what information is that is necessary. For me, I had a student who was interested in going into a medical field who had a very severe alcohol problem, and he wanted to admit to that. I thought that is not the best thing to do in the first statement. I mean, that sort of a thing, I think you have to take into consideration, personal preferences in terms of religion or whatever, that student really has to be.
Oh, I always tell them that they need to make the decision themselves, but I don't know, I have to just to maybe be aware that some people have a bad reaction.
Well, it's a decision they need to make, but it needs to be an informed decision.
Exactly,
And they
yeah.
can inform that decision by going to the department and talking to the advisor, having the advisor look at it, knowing the professors who
Invite
are.
them to their church.
So,
One thing that I'd like to talk about is that students are very good at getting resources on campus and knowing what resources are on campus. And so one thing that they will do is say they're interested in going into one of the health fields or science fields, they'll come and see me. Then they'll come over to the IC. Then they'll go over and CC. Then they'll, but they run all around campus, and everybody sitting at this table has a different way in which they would
That's true.
tell a student to write a personal statement. So it's very important, that students decide who they're going to work with.
Or that they get different opinions and make up their own mind.
Well, I've seen statements written and rewritten and written and rewritten with the student running back and forth.
Yeah.
I mean, and that sort of a thing is not productive for anyone. And in the end, I think there's a lot of confusion. How Joy writes, how I write, are two different ways.
that's really true. It's not productive. And to me, the best thing to do is get to people as close to the admissions committee as you can. So my advice would be go talk to the people that are really going to read your statement if you can.
And I would caution that, when you go to somebody who sits in a school, they have to be very careful, about how much information they give a student, because you can't sort of be, up there saying, well, yeah, write it this way, this way, this way. They have to be rather
They can't
neutral.
they can't guarantee
in
admission.
No, they're not guaranteeing admission, but sometimes they do not give you as much information as if you go to NIC or if you go to the EIP program or to a counselor, because those folks are not as close. I mean, You've always got that question of,
So I have a question to ask the panelists. Should a student have more than one personal statement for different audiences? I mean, one of the things that I hear that you say they should do research, their audience, who's going to read the personal statement. If that's the case, wouldn't that imply that they will have different ones for different
I have a reaction to that. It's not an either or.
Yeah.
I think that, especially for those who are writing 1 or 2 page synopses of themselves, you should have one paragraph in there that stands alone in the sense of, this is who I am. That's something that can be moved from space to space. I would highly discourage you from thinking, all I got to do is change the name of the university and maybe the location, and I've now written something. Because, as we've been talking about overtly and sometimes on subtext, it is all about what does that university value. That's what you're buying into when you're choosing a university. You're not just choosing a program, you're choosing a value system. That's stated. There are going to be certain, sometimes very drastically different values that are championed, if you will, at that university. But I assure you there won't be enough overlap for you just to change the date, the title, and the letterhead, you know. So, but there should be, in my opinion, at least one paragraph that is genuinely me. That goes with me no matter where I go, and that's also to keep you sane, because different universities might have different program titles, yet end up with the same profession.
And going back to what George opened with, it depends on the question. If the question varies from one university to another, then the answer should vary with it.
right, and that will happen though in your secondaries. That does not happen in the initial, or for the students that I see. That doesn't happen in the initial personal statement that they're writing to go to med school or to go to pharmacy schools. It's generally a general statement that will go to all the schools in which they're applying. When the secondaries come back, the secondaries will specifically ask you to answer questions.
How important is the personal statement for medical school, say, in relation to the MCAT scores and the GPA and where you did your undergraduate and all that stuff?
So I think tests are still going to be up there, top of the hit parade as well as your GPA. But the personal statement is going to add that additional layer for you as to, how your experiences, have helped you make this decision. I mean, I think the personal statement truly has to be one of, how did I end up here? And so I think it's important. I think it's important in making, for a school to make a decision on students with like GPAs. I mean, when we, going into medical school, nursing, whatever, where you have high 3 points, going in, high scores, whatever professional test that they're taking, that statement's going to make a difference. It's going to be the deciding factor.
It's when you're sort of on the fringe, on the edge.
Well, I think you just have a lot of students who are all competitive, and it makes the difference.
My impression is that different schools give different weight to personal statements.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, to me that reinforces the comment about what's the university value, but
Yeah,
too many eyes, because we're talking about medical field, right?
Yeah.
And my interpretation of the medical field, the practice of it, of just the concept, is it's not about the doctor per se. So me using a lot of I did this, I did that, versus not necessarily more general terms, but not watering it down either, but saying it in a different way, restructuring it to where it's still about you, but the
In
I
the
is
best
it
voice.
first. Yeah, we see it all the time in our different fields. You watch authors fourth person themselves, if that's possible in an article, where they're talking and it's not even third person. It's like this whole other space, but it's you, but that's what's valued in that field. So, yeah, I mean, it's a crazy concept, but I mean, you feel it.
There are also fads, in the university, because there was a fad. I mean, there was a time when you never used the first person in a research paper. Then for a while you did use it. Now we're back to not using it. So it does, sort of goes back and forth.
But some of it gets back to what Steve's saying about, it's almost a little bit about finding a good fit between how you want to represent yourself and the institution, what they're looking for. It's partly that.
Well, I think that goes back to what Carlotta was saying about doing your homework from the very start. You got to know not only what you need to have on your resume, but then what schools you want to go to and what they want you to
I do want to stress, most importantly, that I promise you the personal statement is not as hard as it may feel right now after listening to us. Because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about takes place before you write the first sentence. I'm not going to count it all as prep work, but I mean, it's the orientation. I would even add a piece we haven't talked about, which is tone of that email. Well, we kind of talked about it, but we're talking about it in a different way, which is, I would encourage you to be very cautious of the imagery you're using. You know, first thing that comes to mind is, I'm a fighter. Everyone says that, but what is the image that you're really invoking by using that type of
what
image?
shows that?
You know, so those things are to be aware of. And it sounds really hard. These are things you do at the end, quite frankly. Don't get bogged down in the process. But nonetheless, even things along those lines, what's the feeling, not just that I get from reading my own statement, but that I'm going to engender from somebody else reading this? If I've got a lot of war imagery, that may work for you, may not. Depends on the context. You know, if I got a lot of flowery imagery, that may work, it may not. So just to be aware.
I've never heard I am a fighter in
Well,
a statement.
I was trying to give an example of something that somebody might say, thinking of, hey, everybody says that, but what does that really mean?
But I would disagree with you.
Find something that illustrates that.
I would disagree that it is as difficult, if not more so, than what we're saying here.
I think it's one of the hardest things to write.
Yeah, I mean,
That's what students say.
Yeah, you really have to sell yourself. You have to, you know, you're that BMW, whatever, is the hot car these days as compared to, you know, a Volkswagen bus.
Saturn.
A Saturn.
A nice
Okay.
little Saturn.
And you've really got to sell that. And it's very difficult for students to do because they always say to me, I can't write about myself. I can't do this. This is too hard. You know, I've been, and we're very good, most of it, those of us who are parents, of teaching kids, to be gracious and everything else. And they have to doubt themselves. The other thing I would say is, I do have the students count I. I have seen up to 47 eyes, in one paper. It's like, that's overwhelming. And read that thing out loud. Read your personal statement out loud. Get in front of them here and read it out loud. And if you start stumbling over anything, it needs to be.
Yeah, have somebody else read it out loud because they're going to be even more likely to stumble.
And I'll give one inside tip that is a pet peeve of mine. If you look at your page and it's got one paragraph, but your page is full, there's something wrong with it. What stage are you going to with the degree? I see it all the time. If you took a breath, that means there should be a paragraph break. That's the best way to think about it. But, well,
Unless you're,
I'm trying to perfect the one-word paragraph. I'm getting closer. But nonetheless,
It is true that personal statements are among the most challenging people have to write, and for some students it's torture. But getting to me, I just love personal statements, and you can have fun with it. You got a whole bunch of problems you got to solve, and it's very creative in a problem-solving way. And you just got to have the right attitude of being patient with yourself and trusting that it's going to happen. And I don't know, I love it because I can read the statements 10 times and think of different things each time. I just think it's a great, fun process. And for some students, they discover the fun of it all too. And at the end, if you feel like you've got a great statement and you're really happy, it's a good feeling.
because you know yourself.
So I guess at this point we could conclude this. I'd like to thank you all. It was a great discussion. I hope the audience finds this very helpful. And now you know who these experts are, and you can come and see them personally.
Each one many times.
Each one many times, and go as many of them as you want, even though it's not productive. I don't know. You make that decision. And thank you all.